Sure.
Do you have the votes to pass health care reform on Saturday?
You know, if the vote's held on Saturday, certainly the votes will be there. But I can tell you that as late as last night and again this morning, some of those undecided members of Congress, primarily on the Republican side, that's all we're counting on at this point, are so close to yes that I'm very optimistic that whether the vote is tomorrow or Saturday or next week, that the votes will be there to actually pass this to the Senate, make sure that it becomes better. It's not necessarily a more conservative bill, but it is a bill that lowers premiums for the American people, allows us to hopefully get onto tax reform in a very quick fashion in the coming days.
So I want to be clear here. The votes are there from the House Freedom Caucus as well as the Republicans in the House of Representatives.
You know, actually, I'm not the whip for the entire GOP conference, and so I appreciate you clarifying that. Certainly from the House Freedom Caucus, we took an official position, which means more than 80% of our members are on board. Actually, it's a little bit more than that. And so based on a previous whip count, as long as we don't have any more defections, I think that we will be there.
And do you anticipate there will be a vote Friday or Saturday? And what's
I think the jury is out. You know, we're very cautious to not set an unrealistic expectation.
You want to vote Saturday?
I mean, I certainly want to vote. You know, I wanted to vote last month. We just need to make sure we got it right for the American people. But yes, if we have to stay here and vote on it on Saturday on behalf of the American people, we're committed to do that. I think a number of my colleagues are.
So you've been in constant communication with the White House, I'm assuming, and with President Trump. Do you speak with them, I would assume, regularly, daily?
Yeah, I don't know that it's daily, but it's certainly every other day talking to someone in the administration, whether it's the president or vice president. I know that we've had some good communication with the vice president a number of times over the last 2 or 3 days. The president and vice president have been all hands on deck to make sure they get this done.
So Vice President Mike Pence has been extremely influential in helping to navigate all of this.
I think if your viewers and listeners understood the level of engagement from the White House, both at the president and vice president level, they'd be astonished. I'm surprised. As you know, as a former CEO, you know, normally those negotiations happen at a staff level, but these have been really at the highest level.
They're doing it themselves.
Yeah, it's important. It's a campaign promise that they want to fulfill.
This definitely, this has been labeled the MacArthur and Meadows Amendment, so to speak. Tell our listeners, tell our viewers what exactly it would do.
Yeah, and it's really Tom MacArthur's amendment. I've spent a lot of time with Tom, but I want to make sure that he gets really the credit, because it was his willingness to engage when negotiations broke down. It was two members of Congress getting together that represent two very different districts. So what this does, it allows states and those governors of those states to waive out of some of the Obamacare federal mandates. So it pulls the decisions back to the states, allows premiums to come down. In fact, we have some independent analysis that would indicate as much as 36% drop in some of our premiums. So we're encouraged by that. That was the big thing for the Freedom Caucus, is as long as the average consumer could open their bill and say, this went down, not up, and they could celebrate.
Listen, I covered President Trump's campaign for more than a year. We went all over the country. And I want to ask you this from getting out of the weeds, so to speak, for a second. What do you say to voters, to Democrats, to Republicans who voted for a Republican-controlled Congress and a Republican-controlled White House because they wanted the Affordable Care Act either repealed, replaced, fixed, whatever? Really, they wanted their premiums to go down. What do you say to folks who are watching this all unfold and just saying, why can't Washington get it done?
Well, I would say two things. One is, you're right. It is about getting premiums to come down. They could care less what you call it, as long as premiums come down. But the second part of that is this is a president who will not take no for an answer. I mean, he's going to get it done. You were on the campaign trail with him. You saw the thousands, tens of thousands of people that would show up. He's got a board in the White House that takes every campaign promise and he checks it off. And so this one, he's not going to let let Congress stand in the way. But I will say it took 17 months to get Obamacare put into place. We're probably going to have this out of the way, or at least modified, in 17 weeks. And so sometimes the expectation doesn't realize the slow pace of which Congress works.
I want to shift gears now. I want to talk about tax policy.
Sure.
Because big tax policy plan coming out yesterday. Are you concerned, or is your caucus concerned about how to pay for this tax plan?
Well, sure, we're concerned about how to pay for a lot of things, not just tax reform. But when we look at that, there's been a big push. Does it have to be revenue neutral?
Yeah.
This border adjustment tax. We're more in favor of making sure that tax reform happens. And so, if the markets are listening, you've got a conservative saying that we're going to do tax reform, meaningful tax reform, lower those corporate and personal rates down to get this economy going at 4% again. And so in that, does that mean that we may have some flexibility on the revenue neutral part? I think the answer is yes. That's not necessarily a fiscally conservative position, but as long as we have a longer term plan to make sure we balance and get our fiscal house in order,
Let me ask you a wonkier question about the Durbin Amendment, because there's been some questioning amongst the financial crowd about where exactly conservatives lie on the Durbin Amendment. Where do you lie on the Durbin Amendment?
We haven't taken an official position on that, and we probably won't. I mean, just to be honest, what we're really looking at is trying to get the tax policy right for people on Main Street and people on Wall Street. And when you do both of those together, the economy thrives. And so as we look at it, that's one that we're probably not looking at taking an official position on, but we can say that we're having meaningful conversations both with our GOP leadership and the White House on tax reform so that we don't fumble. I think what you're going to see is not only are we going to run with the ball, but we're going to run and get in the end zone very quickly.
Let's talk about prospects of a government shutdown. Will the government be open come Friday?
Yeah, I think, in fact, the government will be open on Friday. I think there's no one that has an attitude of shutting it down.
Is a weekly CR, is that realistic to pass weekly budget extensions?
No, I'm a business guy. Long term, in Washington, D.C. is 2 or 3. Well, I think we shouldn't be surprised by a deadline that we've known about. I often say that's like a florist being surprised by February 14th and Valentine's Day. You can't be surprised by it. We knew it was coming. And so my encouragement to the administration as recent as yesterday is, all right, maybe we fumbled on this, but the next funding, we need to do it 30 days in advance.
Does the wall have to be included?
I think the wall is important. You were on the campaign trail with President Trump. I don't necessarily believe that it will be in this short-term CR, but it's going to get done. I've talked to the president himself about that, and he's going to make sure it gets done.
So here we are coming up on the eve of President Trump's 100th day in office. What has been his biggest success, and what has been his biggest misstep?
Well, I think his biggest success obviously would be a Supreme Court nominee. When you look at that, that's going to have implications well beyond when he leaves 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. But in addition to that, if you're talking about legislatively, the Congressional Review Act, he was able to actually roll back rules, regulations that are 1,000 times more than any previous president in the history of our nation, using that particular act to roll back regulations to allow them, miners to go back to work, farmers to be able to do it, for a number of aspects. He's used that power with the help of Congress to get that done. And so that's a big plus. Additionally, a lot of his executive orders, as we've seen that, are already having impacts. His willingness to engage on health care out of the box was important.
Biggest misstep?
Probably the biggest misstep would be believing that Congress moves faster than they really do. And so I don't know that I chalk that up to anything other than a business guy realizing. And when I came here, I said, well, gosh, a good idea should be able to get through. Well, there's so many competing agendas. So it's learning who to trust, who not to trust, who serves him well and who doesn't.